Welcome to the Ohio Adult Allies podcast, where we are developing, inspiring, and empowering youth leaders. Today's topic is opportunities for involvement in decision-making processes. Today we are talking with Holly Jacobson.
My name is Holly Jacobson. I'm the Youth-Led Prevention Coordinator at the ESC of the Western Reserve, which is up in Geauga County. I have been doing youth-led for about 7 years, and we actually have about 12 different youth-led groups, including a countywide residential. We have residential facilities, alternative schools, middle and high school groups. So we've done quite a bit of youth-led work.
Haley Shamblin.
I'm Haley Shamblin. I work for Impact Prevention out of Southeastern Ohio, and our youth-led group is actually called Impact as well. I started with youth-led as a kid. So I started in middle school and was with kind of the same group that I'm with now, even throughout high school. In college, I worked part-time, but been full-time for about 10 years, kind of on and off with teaching and other things as well. So it's an awesome place to be.
And your host, Holly Raffle.
I'm Holly Raffle. I'm from Ohio University's Wonderfit School of Leadership and Public Affairs. I've been with the Ohio Adult Allies Initiative for about 10 years now, but my involvement in youth-led programs actually started much earlier. In the late 80s and early 90s, as a high school student, I was involved in peer-led prevention, and it really just stuck, and I've been involved in it some way, shape, or form ever since.
Opportunities for involvement in decision-making processes.
Hello, and welcome to the Ohio Adult Allies podcast series. I'm Holly Raffle, and today I'm excited because I have two adult allies here, and we're going to discuss how to create opportunities for young people to have meaningful involvement and voice in decision-making processes. I'm glad both of you are here today, and I thought I'd kick it off by going to Holly. What roles and responsibilities do young people have in your youth-led programs?
So that is a great question. We are really student focused. So our young people are the center. They are decision makers. They are the ones that have the responsibilities. They have the roles. So we have, specifically with our countywide group, we have an entire structure. We have a president, a vice president. We have a social media person. We have different tasks or different roles that our young people they have this whole process where they get elected into that position, but they have those roles. And then we also have, the rest of the students that are there with us, that everybody has the responsibility of creating an environment that is safe, that is friendly, that is welcoming. Everybody has the responsibility to be non-judgmental, to really be open and accepting of others. The other responsibility or the role is to really want to be there to make a difference and make a change.
Haley, tell us a little bit about the roles and responsibility that Impact has young people play.
Okay, so we also have our countywide groups, and then we have our in-school groups. So kind of like Holly mentioned, our countywide is a little bit more structured. We actually don't have like the officers anymore, the vice president, but we do have like our social media group or our icebreakers group, and we kind of let them decide their roles and responsibilities. So a meeting is coming up, what role or responsibility needs covered, and then based on that, the roles and responsibilities are kind of divvied out based on that. And I guess we'll talk a little bit more later about how those are divvied out and things, but the roles and responsibilities are just what needs to be covered. Just like Holly said, anybody that wants to be there needs to be there to have a purpose or to have a goal and be participating. And then within our schools, we have a little bit of different roles and responsibilities set up, because not all the kids that come to the countywide meetings come to the schools. So one big role for us is like a reporter. So, okay, who's our reporter? Who was at the countywide meeting that can tell what happened there? So it's not just us coming into the school and be like, oh, we had a countywide meeting, this is what happened. No, that's not on us as adults, that's on the youth themselves. So they'll come in, so we usually have a reporter. At those meetings, we often have note takers, and just they facilitate the meetings themselves. So just a couple different roles in the schools and within the countywide meetings.
Let's back up just for a minute, because I heard both of you say something really interesting. So the idea of roles and responsibilities of young people when they agree, hey, youth-led is something I want to do. What's that core role and responsibility that a member has to bring to the table that every member shares?
I think a role or responsibility that every member shares, we sometimes do contracts with our kids, and on those contracts, or they're kind of their roles and responsibilities is just being a positive role model, agreeing to make healthy choices. So anybody in our youth-led group has agreed to make healthy choices, agreed to be a positive role model, kind of agreed to participate, and not necessarily on the contract, but we're constantly building guidelines within our group to create that community to where it's an open space to where anybody can share. Our CEO likes to call it the Vegas rule, but almost every time on our guidelines, we use the Vegas rule, like what happens in our impact meetings stays in our impact meetings, unless it were to be, of course, something that's going to harm yourself or harm others. But we like to really enforce those guidelines to create that sense of community for our kids.
I really have to agree with what Haley said. I mean, we have, for our students, we do have them as responsible for their own actions, their own behaviors, their own, really just how they are, not only when they're in the group, but when they're out in the community, because, they spend a lot of time doing youth-led work, right? They do this, I think, sometimes more than we do. And, because this is their life, this is what they're trying to do, is create this change. And, they're representing themselves and the other young people anywhere they go. So if they're out in society, if they are at school, if they're in the community, if they're in, during one of our meetings, they're representing themselves as well as others. And so we really, because we also have a contract as well, and we have a couple pieces. And one of that is, how are you presenting yourself? Again, in all those different areas, their role is really just being them, being true to themselves, but being responsible and respectful at the same time.
So what I'm hearing is, it sounds like individuals come and they have a set of personal responsibilities and how they contribute to the group. And then the next layer of that is really thinking about all that needs to be done for day-to-day operations of how the youth-led program is implemented. So Haley, could you talk a little bit about how those groups, you mentioned social media group, you mentioned an icebreaker group, how are those groups formed, and how do young people kind of select where they want their involvement to be?
So again, those are formed based on kind of like a needs basis, based on what strategy or event we have coming up. So we don't always have the same icebreaker group, but so we get together for a planning meeting for whatever event or strategy we're about to implement. And we kind of just bounce around ideas, and we say, okay, or whoever's leading the meeting, often a youth will say, okay, guys, what's the next step to planning? What all needs done? Okay, we need energizers. So they'll write energizers up there. Who feels strong about an energizer they'd like to do? And they write a name down. And no, we won't sit and make sure that everybody's name's on that piece of paper, because sometimes that's a little bit intimidating to make sure my name gets on that piece of paper when I know I have an exam coming up and I know I have finals coming up. So we usually like to make sure that each area is covered by at least 2 to 3 people. And then at the end of the meeting, we'll say, okay, as you're leaving, just make sure if you're interested in one of these groups, you join. And we kind of try to keep track of that as the meetings go on, because we don't want the same kids doing the same thing all the time, when the same kids not getting to participate at all. So what we'll do is kind of keep track of that. We keep notes of that. And instead of making it an open thing like, Holly, why don't you do this? Like, we'll go to her separately, be like, hey, Holly, I've noticed that you've not gotten to be head of a committee, or, you've not been involved. Is there something that you see yourself wanting to be a part of? And we kind of bolster that within them rather within the whole group.
So it sounds like you have sort of this needs-based or ad hoc approach to defining roles and tasks, and then the responsibilities kind of evolve based on. So Holly, you talked a little bit about defined roles at your county level. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that sort of comes to fruition with the group?
Sure, absolutely. So with our county group, we do have, it is more structured. We do have, like I said, the president, the vice president, we have social media, we have data, we have several different positions in that. Now, does that mean because they're the president or the vice president, they get to make every decision and tell everybody what to do? Absolutely not. What it looks like, they are there as kind of the guiding force for the rest of everybody, but they're not making the decisions for everyone. So it is still an entire group process and decision making, but there are certain roles that are defined. And so what they have to do is they have to say, yes, I'm interested in being in that position. And then they actually apply, and they talk about, like, this is why I'm interested. This is why I want to be in this position. This is why I think I would be, great for this. And then, we do a vote. And then from there, there's a couple different things. So we do a vote, and then they interview with the director and myself. And then it's all of that is taken into consideration and made into a decision of where young people are best suited in that. But again, just because they're in that position doesn't mean they're making decisions for the entire group.
So what discussion and deliberation strategies do you use with your young people involved in your youth-led program? So if you have a space where you either need to make a decision about the direction you are going to take, or about even something like a meeting structure, how do you facilitate those types of discussions so that deliberation can occur and young people feel safe and they understand how to deliberate and make decisions?
We have a couple different steps and a couple different processes that we use. So I mentioned that we do have the president and the vice president, and we have our cabinet that is the one tier of what our council is. So what we really try to do is, especially with the president and vice president, who are the ones that actually run our meetings, is we really take them through a training, as well as several other students. We take them through a training of how to facilitate meetings, how to understand when, you know, there's an interesting dynamic that's starting to happen, and how do we kind of address that in an appropriate way? How do we make sure that, you know, if we have somebody that's over here who's super quiet and doesn't say anything, how do we address them and bring them into the conversation or get their opinion? So one of our first levels is we actually do training with our young people on how to do those facilitations and how to notice those things within the room. So it's not always just us as the adult allies, but also they're starting to notice amongst their peers, you know, what's going on as well. And so that's the first thing. And then the other level is that we really like to set the precedence that this is a welcoming group. It is open. It is, everybody has an opinion and every opinion is okay. We need to be respectful. We need to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. We might not agree, and that is okay. You might not like everybody in here, and that is okay, but we're going to be respectful, and we're going to figure out how we're all going to share our opinions. And so that's really like, that expectation happens from the very beginning that they come in the door, so that if there is a concern, they're not thrown off guard like, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. And so we do a lot with that. And the other big piece is we do a lot with KSA. So, you know, we don't always want to just provide our students with the knowledge, but we're providing them with the skills, again, how that training that we do for our president, vice president, and others, as well as like having them that attitude piece. So a lot of what we're doing is based on those KSAs.
Haley, what are some strategies that you use that support kind of the general understanding that Holly talked about, you know, group behavior, group expectations, but when you really want to move towards deliberation and decision making, what are some strategies that you use in your groups?
So I like what Holly said about, you know, everybody's opinion matters. So I think the very first step, like she said, is just validating. So everyone at that meeting, every opinion is not only heard, it's recognized, and it's usually written down. So 9 times out of 10, when those opinions, those decisions are written down, 9 times out of 10, everyone in the group will be able to look at those and choose kind of like the top 3. So we usually like, okay, which ones would you vote for your top 3? So one strategy we do is we leave them all up on the board. We ask everybody to vote for a top 3. We compile those and put the top 3 back up there. And I know sometimes it's like, oh, but what about that one that was rejected? And we don't necessarily say that's rejected. We say that's put on hold. Okay, that's an awesome idea, but that strategy doesn't really fit what our problem of practice is right now, or that strategy isn't really doable for us at this time. So it's not a no, it's a let's table it for later. So after we've tabled those strategies or ideas or the decision making that they're working on, we've got those 3 main ones. And what we kind of do is we allow the kids to make committees. So we'll say, okay, you know, who feels really, really strongly about number 1? And they can get together and kind of make their case for that. Who feels really strongly about number 2? Who feels really strongly about number 3? And it's hard to just talk about blank decision making, but if it were about a strategy, they might have data to support that strategy, or they might have reasons why it would work in their school. But we really let them make the case for it. Sometimes we will do, okay, everybody present their strategy and we'll do a vote. And then another one we've done, actually learned from Ohio Adult Allies, was kind of like the snowball consensus. So everybody gets to vote their point, and then slowly, you know, as people from number 2 are like, oh, I kind of like the idea of number 1 better, they join number 1 and kind of do like a snowball effect of what exactly strategy or what decision we want to make for this point in time. Again, the decision or the opinion of 2 and 3, not that we'll never do those or those don't matter, but at this point in time, number 1 is the choice that our group needs to kind of go with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of setting the groundwork. So we'll kind of shift into then, Haley, about how do you engage young people in discussions and deliberations based upon local data? So you have a decision to make and you want to incorporate local data, does that help, give you a little context about what you would do to support that?
Yes, it definitely does. I love giving our kids data to work with. Actually, one of the first projects I went to Ohio.Allies doing was when I got there and they handed me this data and I was like, wow, like I feel important. Like I feel like an expert. And I think our kids get that feeling too. So when you hand them that packet of data on mental health, like they feel like the expert on mental health in Lawrence County. When you're given the data on e-cigarettes, whatever data they're given, they feel like the true expert. And you'll notice they feel like really big passions around it very quickly. It's almost hard to hear what other people have to say because of that. So if I was given the e-cigarettes, I'm like, e-cigarettes is the way to go. Like, I know this is the problem of practice. I know this is what I want to do, until I hear Holly talking about her problem of practice. I'm like, oh, she's got a good point. So some ways we let them work with that data is, again, we give them a few minutes to work in groups of 3 to 5, and they get to pour over that data, look at every single aspect of it. They get to compare it to the state. They get to compare it over time, and then they get to kind of report that out. And again, we use those same kind of techniques, like the snowball techniques, just voting based on the data and just allowing them to make decisions as a group, and not only looking at the data in front of them, but looking at, if we have it available, we'd love to have their school data. And then if they're in between two, because sometimes our data shows that we could have 2 problems of practice, we honestly let them at that point look at passion. So if data can support both of these, what is your passion and what are you seeing in your schools? Because I could go to a teacher and they could say, oh yeah, we have a real big problem with e-cigarettes because I had to steal 5 joules today. But when we talk to the kids, it's like, no, we're really struggling with anxiety and depression. Like several of my friends are dealing with this, and our kids are the boots on the ground to really know what's going on there. So I think data is really, really important, and we always make sure that they can back it up, but understanding what it is that they see going on in their schools is really important as well.
Holly, from your practice, what are some of those key ways you all engage young people in decision making around data?
So I think we're a little bit different than Haley is in the fact of, honestly, we don't have local data. Several years ago, we had a political thing happen where there were people that made a decision for every school in the county that were not allowed to ask questions and do data collection. We start with nothing. So when our young people, we kind of do a little bit of the opposite. We start on like, what do you really personally see as a problem? And then how are we going to collect data to know that that's really what's happening? And so we kind of take it from a totally different approach because we don't have that access. The most local data we have is state. So our young people, we really sit down and say, hey, this is where we're at. This is what's going on. How do we, like, you guys are telling me that, but how do I know that? Because if I go ask your teachers, they're going to tell me, that drooling is a huge thing, but you guys are telling me it's stress and anxiety. How do we know that that's really the case? So then they honestly start to say on their own, well, we need to collect data. Okay, well, how are we going to do that? And so then it really becomes almost their idea as to that they think, they're like, well, we need to know so that when we do our initiatives and our planning and we can do all this and we reevaluate, we know that it's changed. They take hold of it because it's then theirs. And then they're then creating these questions or their data collection. Like they're the ones that are creating the data, not creating the data, but creating the collection of it. It is like really at heart for them. And it becomes really important. I mean, we've had our students go in and meet with our mental health agency, like the one that runs our co-plan is like, we need you to start collecting data for us because we're missing all this and we don't have this. And to have a high schooler sit there and ask for data is, people are just mind blown and it's amazing. And they take pride in knowing what that is and using it.
So it sounds like data is an essential part of decision making. Why would you say that that's such an important piece in making decisions?
Everybody has a passion or everybody has something that is important to them. And that's wonderful. But if we don't have data to back it up, how do we know that that's a problem for a majority of people or for most people? How do we know that the things that these students are doing and they're creating, how do we know that it's changing? And without that data, we really don't know if it's creating the impact they want to. We don't know if, in 2 and 5 years, if it's still going to have, the outcomes are going to be whatever direction you want them to be going, increasing or decreasing. It's such an important piece for them to be a part of and to know and to really, that's a driving force.
Haley, I saw you nodding your head and smiling, so I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that role that I'm hearing from both of you that data plays in decision making.
Yeah, I completely agree with what she said, that they need to be able to see what they're doing has an impact. I think that no matter what your job is, you want to know that you move the needle. Whether you work at a factory, whether you are a teacher, whatever you do, you want to know that what you're doing is making some type of difference, that you're making some kind of gains. And if you're just shooting arrows in the dark, you're not going to know that you made those gains. So one major word that I always like to use is it has to be measurable. Without data, what we're doing is not measurable. So I just think make sure that it's measurable, and not only for ourselves, but also for our stakeholders, for people that are giving us the grant money, for people that are funding, for parents that are allowing their kids to be a part of our youth led, for anybody that is supportive of us in any way. We need that data to say, hey, we're not just icebreakers. We're not just winning games. Like, we're here to make a difference, and here's the difference we're making, and here's the data to prove it. So I just think always making sure that we're measurable is just a major component for sure.
So you both have alluded to setting an environment where multiple voices are heard, but what are, very specifically for our listeners out there, what are ways you can ensure that everyone has a voice in decision making if they choose to have a voice?
So I think the very first step that we do to make sure they have that voice is, again, just creating those basic guidelines of we will respect one another, all opinions matter, and what's said here stays here. So I think that sets the ground rules of like, oh, this is a place that I can share what I say. But again, that's not always going to be enough for youth. They're going to need that like pulled out of them. So some different things that we do is we do allow time for parent shares. So while I might not be comfortable to stand up in front of the group of 30 people, if I start out the question with, okay, Holly, talk with a friend next to you and tell them your idea, I'll be willing to share it with a friend. And then we let them share out. And sometimes it might even say, instead of asking Holly, I'll look at her friend and say, hey, Holly, can your friend share what you just said? And she's like, yeah, of course. And it's a little bit of like, it takes the heat off when somebody else is sharing your idea, and it takes the heat off that you're not sharing your own idea. So that's one way that we kind of can get some ideas out without the pressure. And one thing that I know we've talked about a lot is the wait time, because I was a second grade teacher before this. So like second graders will share everything they know very quickly. I mean, and I'll know everything about their lives, but as they get older, they need a little bit more of a wait time. So I can't just ask a question and 5 seconds later be like, okay, everybody's opinion is heard. No, I have to make it a little bit uncomfortable. I have to give that wait time before some people will share. So just always giving appropriate wait time, parents share, and again, just validating every response. Because if somebody answers one time and I say, we can't really do that, the chances of that student answering again are very slim. So just always validating those answers is a way that it seems like to get their voice heard and to get them to open up more and more.
Well, I definitely have to agree with the basic guidelines or the expectations. So when they're coming in, they know what the expectations are. They know where they stand and basically what is acceptable and what's not acceptable in regards to how we treat each other and how we listen to each other. The wait time also super important, because that making it uncomfortable, making it a little awkward, and just sitting there and being like, yeah, you sometimes you have to do it. And I think that allows the opportunity, especially for sometimes those quieter people, to share what they're really thinking. And a couple other things that we also do is for some reason this past year we had a lot of very quiet students that were in our group, and so we actually got paddles that were dry erase. And so anytime we were voting or we had an opinion, like, we would have everybody write something down and hold it up, because we noticed that even when we were trying to give that time and that space and that, hey, let's bring it up. And sometimes we'll say, hey, Haley, we haven't heard from you today. Like, do you have anything to add to this? And they were like, no, or whatever. We at least had a paddle that they could hold up with something written on it. Another piece I talked about how we do some training with our president and vice president and some of our cabinet members is, we, after we have a meeting, we sit down with them and say, hey, did you notice anything? Do you think everybody got to share? And sometimes they'd say, well, no, you know what? I actually don't think Haley shared today, and she looked like she wanted to say something. And so then we would go and, we would talk to Haley and say, hey, we were at the meeting the other day, you didn't say anything, but you looked like you wanted to say something. We'd love to hear your opinion. We want to hear it. Do you want to add anything in that we could put in the notes or share with the group next time? So we really try to have all eyes and ears on everything, especially when it comes to sharing their opinion.
So Holly, how does your group ultimately make a decision? You've alluded to voting, you've alluded to consensus, snowball consensus. So if you could just share with our listeners out there, how do you make decisions?
That is the ultimate question. How do we make decisions? Again, using all those different tools that we have in our toolbox is really the basic thing. And I think that honestly, the biggest thing is creating an environment and creating relationships. So relationships with the adult allies and the young people and amongst the young people. And really just, we try to make it fair all around. And sometimes you just can't get to a point where two groups agree. And like you'll have, let's say we do the snowball pyramid, we get it down and we have, group A and group B that are just not agreeing. We really start to sit down and say like, well, how do we define a problem of focus where we all can agree? How do we define, or how do we decide what initiative we're going to start with that everybody can be okay with? And again, like Haley said earlier, it's not a, no, we're not going to do that. It's a, hey, we're going to, which one do we think we should do first? Which one do we think we should do second, third? And which one should we put until we finish these three, and then we'll come back to it. So we never really take anybody's ideas or initiatives or anything off the table. It's a very hard, tactful thing you have to do to get to decision making. It's kind of hard to sum it up in words, I think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what I'm hearing is there's a combination of techniques that you use, but it's also in the moment realizing that sometimes there is no decision. So asking young people, so how, we have to do something, we have to move forward. So where do we start is what I'm hearing. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as an example, I had a group that I was working with, and there was two totally separate things. It was a residential facility, and half of the group wanted to work on homelessness, and the other half wanted to save the world. And I was like, and they were not agreeing. We did every tactic we knew. There was 3 of us adult allies in there, and we were not getting anywhere. So we said, okay, guys, well, where do we go from here? Like, how do we define one thing that we can work on to move forward? And so what they on their own came up with their own decision of, well, if we go out and we collect recycling, which we're cleaning up trash, then we can take it and get money. And then from that money, they then went and bought stuff to put together packages for the homeless shelter. It was like, we just sat there and said, well, we have to have a decision. What are we going to do? And honestly, they were able to put those two completely different things together and make a decision with it. And I think, again, being open and honest with them and just saying, where do we go? Like, we don't know where to go from here. They will eventually come around, and they will think about it together and come up with a solution.
Haley, in your practice, what are some strategies that you use to ultimately make those decisions?
So I completely agree with Holly about like the kind of like almost like you give them a deadline, like this has to be finished by this meeting. We can't carry this on to the next meeting. By the end of this meeting, it has to be done, because I think as humans, we're all like driven by those deadlines, because if I know that I can argue with the other group forever, then I probably will try to push my point. But if I know that this decision has to be made by today, the chances of me compromising with the other group are much more likely. So I think deadlines are a major thing that we try to enforce, and throwing out that word of compromise. Hey guys, is there a way that we can do both of these? And again, just like Holly said, 9 times out of 10, they're going to make it happen. They're going to look at each other and be like, oh, your incentive does make sense, so we could work around it. It does get a little bit tricky with problem of practice, because, as a group, we want one single goal to do our map on, to make our data around. So one example we had was a school really, really, really wanted to focus on e-cigarettes. The data was there, the passion was there, but another half of the group really, really, really wanted to work on mental health. The data was there, their passion was there. So trying to pick which problem of practice we were really going to focus on for the year was difficult. Again, we listened to the data, we wrote it all down, we let them have their time, we had kids switching back and forth, and finally to the point where we're like, okay, our problem of practice has to be set by this date, because we need to move on and start getting our strategies in place. And one of the kids spoke up and was like, but I really want to do this for mental health. And one of the kids was like, do you think that people use e-cigarettes because of their mental health? And it was like a light bulb went off in there. They're like, oh, so we could cover a little bit of the mental health, like we could still, but our main problem of practice be e-cigarettes. So I think telling them deadlines are happening and asking them to compromise. And then unfortunately, there are going to be times that we just have to say, okay, guys, we're going to have to put it to a vote. It's going to have to be majority rules at this point. And again, it comes to that very, very, very few times. Like I can probably think of less than a handful of times in my 10 years, but there have been times that we're like, okay, guys, it's just going to be majority rules and we're going to have to work on that incentive next time. Or we're going to have to figure out how we can make what you want to do work for us the next time, or we can work it in. But oftentimes it works itself on its own, just when you give kids deadlines and you give them the power to make the compromise.
Well, that's a really good segue into my next question is how do you deal with that disappointment that some may feel if it gets to that point where you have to have a vote or you have to, because that's the idea is that we have to learn that my idea is not always going to be the one that puts forward, and how do I live and sit with that disappointment if it's not my preference. So Haley, what are some things as an adult ally that you've had to do to work with young people in that space that can be disconcerting or uncomfortable or disappointing?
Validating. If I could choose one word to describe my job as an adult ally, it would just be to validate. So I validate to the whole group, hey guys, Holly had a great idea. I really love that idea. We're just not gonna be able to go with it this time. Maybe in the future, that's something we can look at, and just validating it to the whole group and kind of just reading off of Holly to make sure, does she need me to touch back with her? Maybe at the end of the meeting, I come to her personally because some kids need that extra boost and then some kids it might just roll off their shoulders. So just having that relationship to know where that disappointment is. And maybe I come to her separately and be like, that was a really great idea, but I think you'd also be really great at this part, and giving them another job and making them passionate about the one that was decided, to make sure that they know just because my choice wasn't picked, I still have a voice in this one and I can still be a part of it. Because sometimes it's like, oh, my team didn't win, I'm out of here. And we just want to make sure that we're constantly pulling those kids back in, just because I don't want to say they didn't get their way because that sounds childish, but just because their opinion wasn't picked, we still want them to be part of the team, and just making sure that they know that they have value, and just thanking them for being bold enough to tell us their opinion is a major thing. But I just think validating at the public level, validating at the personal level, and constantly pulling them back in to be a part of what it is we're doing.
Holly, what would you add from your practice?
Honestly, I don't think I could have said it any better than Haley did. I mean, that validation piece, that acknowledgement on a personal, like she said, I mean, literally it was everything that I was like in my head was like, oh, this is what I'm going to say. Haley literally said it. But that validation piece, on a personal level, seeing them after the meetings, talking to them, hey, I know that your decision didn't get chosen. This is where we're at. Like, how are you feeling? What can we do? I think you'd be really great at this. You're really blah, 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 whatever. So I think it's important to keep that understanding there, knowing that, hey, they are probably going to be upset. And again, some people just roll it right off their back and it's like, oh, well, whatever, I'll help with this. But yeah, just keep acknowledging and bring it back in. And sometimes, even just the next decision, going to them first and saying, hey, like, what's your opinion on this? To bring that conversation right back in with them.
So Holly, we're getting kind of ready to land this plane here. If you could have one piece of advice from your personal practice working with young people to ensure they have a role and a voice in decision making within youth-led programs, what would that be?
One piece of advice I would say is build the environment and build the relationships first. Before you go in trying to use all of your different tools that you've learned and all the different ways to do decision making, really build that environment of the expectations and what the ground rules are, and then build that relationship with those young people. Because the more that the expectations are set and the more that you have that relationship with them, the better off we are going to be able to identify specifically when that student needs a little more attention, or when they need a little more boosting, or when they're doing okay. I would think that that's probably is work on that first, and don't ignore if you ever feel like the student has a look or they say something, like any of those tiny little signs. We have to pay attention to those, and you don't necessarily need to call out in front of everybody, but at least knowing that they're happening and then addressing them at some point, and not just ignoring them. they're there because it's uncomfortable to, to hit those head on.
Haley, what about you from your personal practice? If you had to give one piece of advice that you've learned through your 10 years of experience on how to ensure young people have a voice and a role in the decision-making process, what would that be?
So I know I've said it a lot, but I think that the validate and compliment is just such a big part. But I think I want to add to that is just be real. Like if I forget the agenda, I want the kids to know that. Like, hey, Haley makes mistakes and she's open about it. I just want them to know that that they can be real with me. I don't know how many kids before a meeting will text me and be like, hey, I really can't make it because I have a big exam. And all the other people at work are like, why didn't they tell me that? Like, why? And not that they're not as comfortable with some of the others that I work with, but sometimes I think it's just because I'm open and I'm real. And I'm like, hey guys, my kid was up all night. Like, I'm sorry, I'm half here. And just being real with them and telling them we all have days that we're not going to be 100%. And I think when they see that realness in you, they feel a little bit more comfortable, and that relationship just comes more naturally, and they're going to be more open and ready to give their opinion when they know, oh, Haley's not a judgmental crazy person. She's just a real person like me, and she's going to make mistakes, and I'm going to make mistakes, and it's all cool.
Well, thank you very much for this edition of the Ohio.Allies podcast series. We really appreciate you being here to discuss your personal practice with young people on that topic of opportunities for involvement in decision making. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Ohio Adult Allies podcast. You can find more of our episodes on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play by searching Ohio Adult Allies. Episodes are available at www.ohioadultallies.com.